Good morning, everybody. Thank you. We're starting a few minutes late, so we'll try and catch up. I told the presenters that I'll be quite strict with time, so that we actually have enough time from the floor. I just wanted, in the introduction to this, I was very happy to see this agenda item really high up on the agenda of the schedule for the forum, because I think thinking about macroeconomics at this conjuncture is really important. And I mean, we can think back to when John Maynard Keynes made his huge contribution that actually divided economics into microeconomics and macroeconomics. It came after the Spanish flu, it came after the Great Depression. The focus was on how to have full employment, something that we should seriously be thinking about, but it was also how to rebuild an economy in a just way and to reinsert the state and the role of the state, and understanding the use of macroeconomic policy as central, both fiscal and monetary policy, as central to actually driving a change and central to actually understanding a role of an active state in changing an economy and a shift away from laissez-faire towards actually understanding that the private sector isn't going to do it, and how you deal with unstable financial markets, how you deal with high unemployment, how you deal with bubbles within your financial markets, how you deal with cross-border flows. And these are really, really important things as we start thinking about a just transition. And one of the things we need to, I think, maybe address more within the discussion section is when we think about how do we finance it, how do we pay for it, we have to ask ourselves, can we afford not to pay for it? Can we afford not to finance it? Because the costs of not doing it are existential. And even in the short term, as we've seen from COVID, as we've seen from floodings, droughts, fires, not only South Africa, but around the world, that the costs within a very short time can be extremely high. So I'm not going to carry on with, I'm not giving a talk, but I wanted to say that. I just wanted to introduce our speakers. Our first speakers are Imraan Valodia, who's the Pro Vice-Chancellor for Climate Sustainability and Inequality, and the Director of the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at WITS. So we have, I think, one of the really important people within the South African university system here with us, and hopefully who can be part of driving this agenda within the academy, and hopefully also work with people in other universities. With him is Julia Taylor, researcher at the SARChI as well, who's also focused on climate and inequality. So we'll start with them. We'll give them 15 minutes, and then I'll introduce the other speakers as they come up. Also, if speakers want to further introduce themselves, you've got this, but they may want to say something else about themselves, they're welcome to.
Great, Seeraj. Thank you. It's great to be at it. It's kind of great to be at the TIPS event again. I think I'm one of the few kind of folk in this room that's kind of grey enough to be able to say that I was at the first TIPS forum, and I was also one of the first kind of recipient of a TIPS large grant, which at the time was the large amount of 500 Rand. So it's it's really great. Yeah. So for the last kind of few years, because I kind of made the decision to be a university bureaucrat, I was unable to be here because I was probably dealing with some students protesting or something. But it's great to be here and kind of a huge congratulations so on the 25 years. I think it's fantastic, and TIPS is really TIPS is really done an amazing job. So the paper that we're presenting comes out of joint work that we're doing at the center. It comes out of joint work that we're doing at WITS. We were struck a few months back that there's lots of thinking happening about the just transition, people kind of doing work on jobs, on kind of the energy mix, on all sorts of things. But we were struck by the fact that we think there's not enough thinking on the macroeconomics of the transition. And the way we kind of doing it is that we've kind of created a small group, and the names are all up there. You'll know quite a few of them. And what we do is kind of essentially to meet from time to time to discuss these issues. We've formed a small reading group, and what I'm going to talk to is kind of some of our initial thinking on kind of on this. I'm going to do the presentation jointly with Julia Taylor, and what we've been kind of thinking through is kind of how does one think about this problem in terms of the macroeconomics, and what can we say about how this might kind of play out in South Africa, and to think about how that kind of second question might apply. We kind of using our experience in South Africa with the procurement of renewables, and kind of trying to link our macro thinking with kind of some of the evidence on how South Africa's dealt with the renewables issue, and so kind of in some ways the kind of renewables issue gives us some kind of insight into how we should think about these macro questions. So the way that we're going to split it is that I'm going to talk to some of the macro stuff, and Julia's going to present the renewables work. So I'll go through this quite quickly. You'll all know that South Africa is the kind of 16th highest kind of emitter of kind of greenhouse gases. We've committed to net zero by the year 2050, and the kind of question is what's going to be the macroeconomic impacts of this. Just to give you two examples on the kind of external side of the macro issue, we're going to have to start thinking about the kind of implications, say for example, on the trade account of border taxes that might might apply on the kind of domestic side of that macro question. One example that we're going to have to start thinking about is kind of how do we deal with the massive stranded assets that we're going to sit with through this transition. How are we going to account for that? What's the macro implications of that? So just to expand on kind of on that for a bit, and again, I'm going to move quickly. If you move to the third bullet point there, here's some macro questions that are going to hit us. So this kind of transitions going to destroy a whole lot of capital stock that is sitting on the balance sheet of firms, that's sitting on the balance sheet of the state. How is South Africa going to deal with those issues? Another example from the research group going on in health, it is now quite clear that a 1 to 2% increase in temperatures is going to have serious impacts on health, and that's going to translate into impacts on labor productivity. Again, a huge macro issue that we're going to have to deal with. A third issue that we're going to have to think about. Here's a slide which gives you some sense of some of the causal relationships that are going to impact on fiscal space. So on the trade side, we're likely to see a massive reduction in South Africa's exports coming from impacts on agriculture, and we're going to see a large increase in imports. That's going to mean effects on the current account of the balance of payments, which in turn will impact on the exchange rate, which in turn will likely significantly reduce fiscal space. Add to that the fact that we're going to have to divert large amounts of resources from areas such as social expenditure to other parts of this transition. Think about the impacts on how transport runs, how cities run, etc., and the implications for fiscal space are quite important. Since I'm just about to run out of time, let me then move on to the final slide that I'm going to deal with, and these slides are available if you'd like to get them. Here's a few really serious macroeconomic questions that we're starting to think through, and we're starting to think about what are the implications for South Africa of things. So to give you one example on the growth side, it does seem that there's some evidence that mineral exports from South Africa will likely increase as this transition unfolds. But that's the upside. The downside is, might we have to start thinking about the implications of a Dutch disease in South Africa, and what might be the macro implications of that? So I've used my time. I'm going to pass it on to Julia.
Thanks, Imraan. So yeah, unfortunately, we haven't had time to go through a lot of the questions, but we wanted to go through a practical example of the renewable energy program in South Africa and how South African government has divided the risks and benefits in the program. So within the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Procurement Program, I'm not going to say that again, so I'll just use REAP from now. It was one of the first attempts to attract investment into a new sector, right, in South Africa. And so government ended up taking on quite a bit of risk in order to attract that investment. This has kind of been compared to, or could be criticized in line with various kind of literature around a Wall Street consensus, which says that, we're trying to put private capital and private finance at the center of development problems. However, you can say that this was necessary because it was a new technology, there was a trust deficit with government, but it did end up offering favorable returns and de-risking private investment. It also increased state contingent liabilities, as well as ESCOM debt guarantees, and customers face higher tariffs. So security of supply still remains an issue as well. The power sector has opened up, renewable energy prices are down, risks are now minimized. So the current model is not necessarily suitable any longer. So how do we now think about the expansion of renewable energy going forward and the role of the state in carrying these risks in terms of thinking about a just transition? This is a graph which shows the cost of independent power producers as a proportion of overall energy costs. So you can see that the IPPs, which are the blue line, the percentage cost spent on IPPs is much higher. So that's the dotted line is the cost of kind of compared to the total energy cost. And then the actual solid line is the contribution to energy produced. So you can see that the kind of cost of IPPs really started off very high. The trend is starting to slow down and reduce, but we still question whether kind of carrying this risk is really the best way forward for kind of state support of renewable energy. This is another graph which shows that, on the other hand, kind of in the kind of significant electricity crisis that we face, the open cycle gas turbines, which are used kind of to back up a system that is failing, are much higher cost than IPPs. So we can argue, for either way, but if you incorporate the cost of coal, which seems to be quite low in this graph, if you incorporate the costs on the environment and social issues, we might see a different picture. So some key considerations for the future rollout of renewable energy. Given the substantial decline in price and the maturity of the sector, should the private sector shoulder more of the risk? Is there an appetite to take on that risk? If we move towards corporate power purchase agreements directly with IPPs, what does that look like? How are risks shared? How does this then kind of relate to the existing agreements with renewable energy independent power producers? It becomes kind of a difficult space to compete, where different IPPs face different social policy burdens and different cost structures. So how do we now, once the market starts to open up, manage that, that competition so that we get kind of the biggest public benefit in this space? Okay. I'm going to skip over energy security, even though it's fundamental to a just transition. One of the real issues is that kind of South Africans face, we have 50%, over 50% who are energy poor, facing energy poverty. So we can't think about these issues without considering the consequences for access to services and energy. And not only is that energy access, but also affordability. So affordability is kind of the key crux of this issue, where tariffs are going up. And if in the privatization of the renewable energy space, it ends up that affluent consumers are able to defect from the grid, where does that leave those who are still on the grid but cannot afford to defect, who then have to carry the burden of grid maintenance and other costs? It could increase inequality in energy access. So we need a new path for the South African economy that supports increased productivity, decent work and livelihoods. We urgently need to think about building state capacity to coordinate this just transition, because if we can't ensure private investment results in public benefit, there will be uneven outcomes of the just transition. or of the transition. Climate policy should include social policy, and there's lots of research we need to do further. Thanks very much.
I'm sorry to do that. We started late and I gave Imraan some laxity with his introduction before I started timing you guys. So our next presenter is Nishal Robb. He's an economist with the Center for Competition Regulation and Economic Development at UJ.
Hi, everyone. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Nishal. I'm based at CCRED at UJ. Thank you to TIPS for having me. And yeah, very glad to be here. So our paper, this is myself, Antonio Andreoni and Sophie van Hulen, is about the financialization of non-financial corporations in South Africa. And I'll say at the outset that it's explicitly not at the macro level, so we'll have to try and find each other. Along the way, we're looking at kind of firm level case studies in this paper, but we do think there's a kind of a productive link to be made here. So quick outline, I'll just talk a little bit about why financialization matters, what it is in the first place. Then we'll go very quickly over an analytical framework that we're putting together for analyzing financialization in middle income countries specifically. Then I'm going to go through a case study that we've done on Sasol. Obviously, their role in a kind of viable, just transition is going to be critical. So we're looking at the implications of financialization for the kind of role that companies like Sasol can play. And then I'll conclude with some implications. So why financialization matters? I'll start by defining it. It's very broad, and I'll just go to the most cited definition, which is from Epstein, financialization as the increasing role of financial motives, financial markets, financial actors, and financial institutions in the operation of the domestic and international economies. It's obviously very, very broad, and this is why the financialization literature is really big, really hard to kind of keep up with. And this is also partially why we're focusing very tightly at the level of non-financial corporations. And our kind of outlook is that at the level of non-financial corporations, the main impact on why financialization matters for the topic of this conference is that it undermines the nexus between profit and investment. And what we'll come to at the end is what the implications of that is for industrial policy. I've also been told I need to plug our work is based on a chapter in this book that's come out recently, edited by Antonio, Pamela Mondliwa, Simon Roberts, and Fiona Trigena, Structural Transformation in South Africa. We are chapter 10. It's open source, open access, check it out. And the objective of our research agenda is to kind of understand the unique structural conditions within which financialization of non-financial corporations takes place in middle-income economies. And then we want to evaluate how these conditions shape financialization in these contexts. Our outlook is that it's likely to be structurally different to financialization of NFCs in advanced economies. So that's kind of the outlook. So you can see that hypothesis there. And just to elaborate on the structural conditions, our outlook is that in terms of production, non-financial corporations in countries like South Africa occupy a subordinate position structurally within global value chains. They face in these value chains the kind of challenges of linking up in the first place, linking back, building local production systems, building backwards and forward linkages domestically, and then also keeping pace at the same time. So a very complex and increasingly tricky kind of challenge to face on the production side. On the finance side, they also occupy a subordinate structural position within the global hierarchy of currencies of financial markets. And we see this associated with the kind of risk premia that are paid on bonds of companies in middle income countries. They're subject to exchange rate volatility, the high cost of finance in the first place, and the kind of range of mitigation and kind of risk management strategies that non-financial corporations therefore have to adopt imposes high costs on them, which can kind of exacerbate those outcomes you see at the bottom. It can exacerbate tendencies towards premature deindustrialization, lack of competition domestically and competitiveness internationally, and a range of other things, and exposure to a range of external risks and pressures which we see emerging. I think in South Africa, I would say over the last 20 or so years. Now, the framework we put together looks at sources of financialization and processes of financialization. We're still working on it, so any feedback would be welcome. By sources of financialization, we mean, what is the underlying material basis for firms in countries like South Africa to maintain high levels of payouts to financial actors through dividends, share buybacks, a range of other mechanisms. And then by process, we're looking at the outcomes. So what kind of outflows are we looking at? What kind of costs are imposed on corporations in countries like South Africa? Basically, how financialization is materializing at the level of the firm and its decision-making, its allocation of resources. So we put together a list of kind of different types of rents, which we are saying is this underlying material basis. So you get Schumpeterian rents, which is related to technological or business model innovation that lays the basis for vertical, horizontal power and dominance in markets. Then we look at the rents chains, so value captures along value chains, and essentially what vertical power that dominant firms in economies like South Africa can exert. Market rents related to kind of concentration and collusion, so that's horizontal power in particular markets. Policy rents, a range of things here. This is not exhaustive. Capture of public assets, including through kind of privatization, the distribution of land and resource rights, access to finance, subsidies, other government resources, and then the kind of corporate governance and regulatory framework that pertains in different markets and different sectors. And then financial rents, so levering balance sheets and kind of financial engineering that takes place at firm level. So perhaps selling off so-called non-core assets to raise resources, which then may get paid out as dividends or share buybacks, etc. In here, we also put, in this category, we also put the extraction of kind of surplus profits and rents from upstream suppliers or downstream customers, or even subsidiaries in the case of Shoprite, which is another case study that we've done. I don't want to incur Seeraj's wrath, so I'm going to move a little bit faster. On the processes side, we see, we divide this into corporate financialization processes. So we're looking at outflows of dividends, share buybacks, and interest payments as well. In terms of subordinate financialization processes, we're looking at the impact of cross-border financial flows on firms' resources and the kind of conditions in which they operate. This is visualized here, which is a rather complicated picture. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but what we see, let's see if we can bring up the mouse. I can't. Okay. We see these various types of rents entering the sectoral value chain, and that kind of large blue chevron would represent the kind of lead firm in that value chain. And then we see the process of financialization on the other side, the outcome. So that green arrow at the top represents, the portion of firm profits that are retained and reinvested. Some of that retained and reinvested resources can maybe an investment in capabilities and innovation, etc. The rest quite often is tied up in less productive types of investment, for example, in mergers and acquisitions. And then the two big red arrows, we see the different processes that we discussed in the slide just now. So corporate financialization processes, stock buybacks, dividends, interest payments, etc. And we can see that red arrow kind of extends out from the country level to the regional to the global macro financial market level, and then below that the subordinate financialization processes. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this graph, but just to note that the literature in South Africa on financialization is largely focused on firms that are traditionally part of the minerals energy complex. And so we've done a little exercise. We separate the core sectors of the mineral energy complex, and we note that minerals energy complex is not just the set of sectors, it's a kind of broader system of accumulation. But just this kind of descriptive exercise of separating out the MEC sectors from others indicates that the kind of symptoms of financialization are present in a range of sectors beyond the minerals energy complex. And in particular, I guess one of the symptoms that's indicated there, is that dividend payments are kept up even in periods of loss making, even when conditions and performance are very volatile. So we've done a range of other case studies. I mean, Sasol is obviously historically core to the MEC. We've also done case studies of MTN, of AFCRI, Tiger Brands, and ShopRite in the kind of food system. And we do this because we want to note that sources of financialization are at the level of the firm are shaped by particular opportunities and particular dynamics at the value chain or sector or product level. So then to move on to Sasol, which we're all familiar with, we fit Sasol into this framework. We kind of provide an analysis of the different types of rents that they are able to extract, and we highlight those a few in the middle that we think are particularly important in the context of Sasol. And the critical question, though, that I'll present some data on now is what happens to these rents if a firm like Sasol is able to earn above normal or extraordinary profits. What is happening to those? What's the division between productive reinvestment and other perhaps less productive flows? So here we have Sasol from 2002 to 2019. I won't spend too much time on there, but we see that basically from 2014-15, there's a real downturn in the operating profit, which is the gray area. At the same time as and this is partially due to the oil price downturn and broader commodity price downturn, but you see that the operating profit, that gray area, starts to fall quite precipitously at the same time as they embark on a massive investment drive, which is the white bars. And what we see in that line shooting right up there is that a lot of this is driven by debt. Freudian. Sasol is going into massive debt basically to fund this expansion in its investment, and this is exacerbated not just by the downturn in oil prices, but also poor execution of some of its mega projects, which have tended to be overseas, which we can see in this next graph, which just adds a layer to each of those previous ones there. So in the area, we see the total operating profit, and then the total that's operating profit that's drawn from South African operations. We see total capital expenditure and then capital expenditure in South Africa. So what those two things shows that there's been a big de-link, you can see in this graph, between where Sasol's profits are generated, a high proportion in South Africa, versus where the investment is taking place, high degree of investment overseas. And we also see, if we look at the two lines, that the vast proportion of the debt that Sasol has raised is dollar denominated. And this is problematic because execution of its dollar generating assets has been extremely problematic. This creates a range of risks on Sasol's balance sheet. Now, in going to where, so we've kind of got a picture of what the investment has looked like here. Here we see an indication of the patterns in payouts to shareholders. So you can see in the latter periods, 2010 to 2019, there's been a big uptick in terms of dividends and share repurchases. This is largely driven by dividends, and this is an interesting difference between South Africa and places like the UK and the US. And this is largely due to tax provisions, and the lesson we draw from that is that the regulatory context matters. The state can do things which shapes how these firms behave in terms of their payouts. It's highlighted the role of dividends there. If we add interest payments to dividends and share repurchases, we get what we're calling total distributions to financial markets. And the only point to make here is that financial markets claims on firms' profits, on firms' resources persist even when performance and conditions are very volatile. So you can see, again, operating profit in the gray area, that drops massively, but payouts to financial markets actually persist over that period, even in periods of loss making. This is operating profit. If we look at it in terms of net profit, you'll see even in loss making periods, quite a lot of these large firms continue to pay out dividends and conduct share buybacks, etc. Okay, I'll leave that up there. The main point we kind of want to make on the policy implication side is that, you know, regulatory reforms can make a difference, can be a relatively low cost way to bolster industrial policy, because without a means for the state to regulate and to kind of direct investment by these large players, industrial policy kind of runs the risk of having public resources replace private investments. So ArcelorMittal say, you know, may say, to make the big investments that we need to produce and to use green hydrogen, for example, we need massive subsidies, we need big industrial policy to support those investments, but at the same time, it's a leaky ship. The profits are kind of exiting all the while. So this is, we see as kind of problematic. And just the last thing here to note is that this is Sasol's top investors as of the other day. And we see that between the PIC and the IDC, there's a total of kind of 25% of Sasol's ownership is held by the state. And so the question is, are we going to use that? What are we going to do about it? And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. So I don't have to go there. We'll get our next speaker up to the podium. Thank you very much, Nishal, for sticking to time. Our next speaker is Sarthak Shukla, and he's a public policy professional working as an independent consultant on projects around sustainable development, inclusive economies, and resilience. Thank you.
Thank you. This is my first time at any TIPS forum, and the color of my hair is a testimony to it. Esteemed panel, fellow delegates, participants joining in virtually, and the organizing team of TIPS 2022. Warm greetings and namaste to everyone. My paper is titled Systems Framework for Tracking and Evaluating Justness of Climate Finance, and we bring to you a case study from India. And then I was preparing, as I was preparing for this presentation, it struck me that I'm bringing to this forum a paper, a case study from India, where we take pride in the ideas of Mahatma Gandhi and presenting it in South Africa, where Nelson Mandela's ideas and values are placed highly. So I'd like to borrow a quote from each Gandhi and Mandela, which basically sums up the underlying message of this research paper as well. So it is when Gandhi said that the purpose of the nation is to improve living conditions of the people, or quote unquote, to wipe tears from the eyes of every Indian. It resonates well with when Nelson Mandela said that the real makers of history are the ordinary men and women of our country, and their participation in every decision of the future is the only guarantee of a true democracy and freedom. Therefore, the underlying message that is pinned in this research paper is also of human centricity and people centricity, and the need of the same in bringing climate justice at the forefront of policy making and decision making. Just a shout out to the other co-authors who are probably joining in virtually from India, Aishwarya and Kumair. I'll quickly run through the presentation in the following format. I'll basically put forth the context in which this paper is set, the research design that we followed, and then focusing on the macroeconomic and policy level inferences and analysis, not delving too much into the Indian aspects of it, but what can be the global and generic learnings from the same, and conclude it with certain policy recommendations for the same. So as you can see, and it is evident globally as well, that the needle on climate change and climate action is moving quite swiftly. In the Indian context as well, we have pledged a net zero commitment by the year 2070 and have placed very ambitious and very strict immediate commitments for the year of 2030, which range from reducing carbon intensity of the economy to enhancing the non-fossil fuel-based energy capacity, enhancing carbon sinks, and focusing on climate change adaptation. But at the same time, the climate finance is sort of following short in terms of meeting the required potential. And there's an annual funding gap, which is estimated to be to the tune of $1.14 trillion till 2030 in terms of implementing India's climate goals and commitments. Therefore, the paper is set in this context that how the existing climate finance inflows are also encountered with several structural problems and fallacies when viewed from a bottom-up approach and when viewed from the grassroots that they aim to make change at. One of the things that is largely distressing in the Indian context and elsewhere as well is of greenwashing, where investments at the behest of being labeled as green and sustainable often enjoy all the benefits and incentives that are given to them, but however, they fail to do much constructive impact on the ground. At the same time, there are concerns from certain segments of the expertise domain, which call for the green a surge in green capitalism, which can be translated into the fact that investments, particularly green investments, are unable to bridge the existing income inequalities and inequities which are on the ground. And on the contrary, even in certain instances, they exacerbate the existing inequalities. And from these two challenges that are pertinent in this context, there arises a need for ensuring just transitions or mainstreaming climate justice and social justice in these debates. But one thing which is to be noted here is that these are not new problems or something that have just recently come up. Neither are these exclusive for climate finance sector. These are structural problems that occur in other investment inflows as well, be it the problem of inequities, or be it the problem of gold plating certain solutions as successful while they are not doing the intended outcomes. And therefore, I get reminded of Einstein's quote where he says that you cannot attempt to solve a problem using the same ways which created them in the first place. And therefore, a need for a transformative and a systems thinking arises, which is what we attempt to do in this paper. So the research design was plainly simple. We did a secondary research of public as well as private climate finance strategies. We tried to come up with a top-down view of how climate finance architecture looks like on the basis of these reviews. And then we did a field inquiry in western state of Rajasthan, which is largely a desert state, in particular in the district of Jaisalmer, which is known for one of the largest investments in the country in terms of solar parks and wind parks, and therefore is primed as a green destination for investments. And in the field inquiry we spent around a month with the local community people there, doing qualitative interviews and trying to gather the perspective of how climate finance architecture, particularly the impact and outcomes of climate finance, looks like from their perception and from a bottom-up view. And then we try to match these top-down and bottom-up views in order to get to certain concrete policy recommendations. So this basically is a systems diagram which puts forth of a view of how private climate finance architecture looks like. There are different international as well as domestic investors which use various instruments of equity, debt, bonds, etc. And they plug it into a project implementation agency, which could be a corporate or an NGO. If it is an international investor, there are foreign investment related regulations and regulatory authorities which guard it and govern it. In case of domestic investors, it is basically the domestic laws of the land which regulate it. And then the project implementation entity, again, regulated by various state level as well as union level regulatory agencies, tries to undertake that intended activity as per a risk and return profiling that it's done in terms of or with the objective of undertaking social, economic, and environmental impacts. On the contrary, if we look at a top-down view of, say, public climate finance architecture in the Indian context, there's a state exchequer at the union level, and there are the finance and treasury departments of the state government. They generate their own revenues through tax, non-tax resources. They generate their own capital things. They generate market borrowings. The state level and the state government also receives certain investments and funds in the form of grants in aids and other grants from a divisible pool of taxable revenue, etc. And then these revenue departments or the state exchequers plug in that money into various line departments or the nodal agencies, which are again regulated by various agencies. They undertake or provide incentives or financial and non-financial subsidies to different project implementation agencies, which then go forward in terms of doing the intended activities and achieving climate action. However, there are certain reports and assessments which provide for some critique in these climate finance infrastructures. Particularly in terms of public climate finance, there is a critique that it is often too complicated and opaque and process to understand how each penny is flowing in the system and how it is producing an impact on the ground. There are reduced efficiencies due to regulatory bottlenecks, higher time lapses, and even suboptimal utilization of the money at the end of the tunnel. And one thing which also emerged is there are certain behavioral challenges in terms of how public authorities interact with the community and a collusive or a coercive approach being adopted instead of a more humane and community-friendly one. In terms of private climate finance, the key issues are of lack of regulatory oversight for disclosures, which is to say that not all private entities investing or undertaking the climate action activities are regulated to disclose the kind of impact that they are producing. Only certain thresholds are set, say to the tune of 1,000 crores. If your turnover is above 1,000 crores, you are required under voluntary guidelines to regulate and disclose of the sustainability, inclusivity, impact, and other indicators there. And again, as I mentioned previously, the issues of greenwashing and green capitalism persist therein. Okay. So in terms of this top-down infrastructure, the metrics that are made visible to us from these investors and from the state are what is the quantum of investment that is there. They generally boast of the millions and billions that they plug in the name of climate finance. Certain actors take it on themselves to even calculate the avoided emissions and come out with quantitative climate benefits. There are economic benefits that are often highlighted in terms of the rate of returns or the profits that certain green ventures can prove in. And there are social benefits that they come to, which they quantify in terms of number of jobs and the number of people that their direct and indirect operations reach to. However, when we spoke with the people on the ground, it presented a contrasting image of metrics that people perceive and want to see in those climate finance investments. In their opinion, the social benefits must go beyond just quantitative numbers to qualitative indicators that suggest how these investments have been addressing the existing social and cultural inequities, be it in the form of caste or gender or other social hierarchies that are prevalent there. The economic benefits must also go beyond just numbers to providing qualitative assessment of how local area development and inclusive and sustainable incomes are generated out of the same. And similarly, environmental benefits are something that is, again, a very tricky thing. People at the ground don't really care that much about a number in terms of CO2 emissions that the company is saving, but more in terms of how their environmental practices are in consonance with the local and cultural practices that they follow in terms of preserving the environment. There are certain procedural indicators and behavioral benefits that people also expect. The processes that are currently being followed in climate action, both via public and private finance, have been often termed as opaque, and therefore people are advocating more for a TAP approach, which is transparency, accountability, and participatory nature of policy planning and implementation. And often in India, it is said that the key bureaucracy and the bureaucratic officers, which are called IAS, the Indian Administrative Services, people often criticize them by saying them that they are instead Indian arrogant services. And therefore, there's a need for a behavioral change in the way the authorities perceive these people. And the new ideal compact should be one where the authorities, the investors, and the community have a mutual respect towards each other, and the existing power dynamics are shared. And therefore, in conclusion, I'd just like to present a 5-pronged strategy, which is again derived from the research-based evidence. And this, just to mention it here, it does not account. Yeah, I'm just concluding. So it discards the exceptional good cases that are also on the ground, but it is largely derived from the research and evidence that is widely pertinent in the Indian context as well as across other jurisdictions. First is that we need to place a system for tracking and assessing climate finance, a system that measures the right kind of indicators, which are not merely quantitative in nature, but also include qualitative assessments. To do that, we need a facilitative regulatory framework, which can be gradually and systemically designed so that the entire spectrum of instruments of regulation can be used, which implies that on one hand, or in the initial phases, one can be more command and control in their approach towards regulation, while having at the back of their head the aim that finally and gradually we need to move towards a soft touch regulation and self-regulatory phase where the system automatically moves in such a way which is desirable and beneficial for all. And then again, bottom-up approach and focused efforts for behavioral change goes without saying, and these are parallel developments that need to happen. So to sum up, if we want to ensure that terms like sustainable finance, sustainable development, and just transition don't merely remain fancy terms or buzzword at best, but they also do not turn into an oxymoron at worst. Thank you.
I think seeing that there's a video, an 8-minute video before lunch, it leaves us with about 20 minutes. So I'm not going to take 5 minutes for discussion time. I did take a bit of time in the beginning. I just want to say thank you very much to all the presenters for the papers, and also apologize for being a bit harsh on the first group. I did give them more time than the others. I also just want to say that with one sentence on each of the presentations, I think the macro in the first paper can be actually done within a much stronger foundation of a macroeconomic framework, and that diagram you have can be replaced by actually thinking through things from an expenditure side, from a value-added side in terms, and then look at the sectors, and then add to that things like financialization, concentration of the economy, the structure of the economy, and think about what that means for especially the part that Julia presented on the transiting within certain sectors. I think with Nishal, I thought that was a really good and comprehensive presentation of financialization, and to disagree with him to say that I think it's got everything to do with macroeconomics. I think that the way in which your macroeconomy functions, the way in which your economy functions now is within a global financial architecture that's very open, but also a financialized domestic economy. And I think it raises the question in South Africa, given the level of concentration, given the level of externalization and investment abroad by large corporations, what do we do with Sasol and the intensive energy users? Are they actually contributing at the macro level and also at the micro level to the development? And can they be part of this just transition? And then what does it mean when the state is really involved in that? And that brings me to my comment on the last paper. I think that's a really important thing to think about finance and just finance within that situation. I really like the mapping out. I think what I'd really like to see maybe as a broader research project is then to locate that within the national financial architecture. Because if we look at in South Africa, for instance, and what's happened with renewables, we talk about so many billions on REAPs and that things, but it's minute. And we're also then seeing, public money like the PIC, etc., not necessarily going into the just transition stuff, but into the Sasols and the old MEC type structures. So sorry, I think I took more than a few minutes. I'm going to try and have 2 rounds of questions of around 4 to 5 speakers at a time. I'm going to ask you to limit yourself to 2 to 3 sentences for your questions. So no speeches, no lectures, no long comments. And I'm going to be even more strict than I was with the speakers in doing that. So let's have hands. They've got a mic up there and they'll be answering. So we'll take 4 or 5 questions, please. I see one down the middle. Because of this light, I can't really see who you are. So in the second, we'll call this columns and rows. Second column, one in the third column on that side, I see. Anybody else? One in the last column. and then one in the first column. So let's start with the second column, go to the third column, last column, and then first column. Please start. Do you have a microphone?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Life Mahlaule from Emalahleni Local Municipality. My question goes to Julia. I think she was rushed somehow. I want to get clarity on the question that she was raising about decentralization, which directs revenue away from the municipality who are already financial constrained. So maybe she can unpack that for me to get clarity on what they mean on it.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Thank you very much. My name is Rendani Mamtiswana from Nafasi Water. I'll go straight to the question. On the factors that will negatively impact growth, I'm just wondering, there was no conversation around what will positively impact growth. Does this mean that by automatically switching that over, then we are able to drive growth? If you could expand more on that, on what will positively drive growth, and I think that should be the emphasis of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. This over here, the first column, the person could end.
Thank you. My name is Rita Ndlovu from the National Union of Mine Workers. My question is directed to Mr. Valodia on the impacts on health. I just want you to expatiate on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And last question in the first column on the side, right on the other.
Morning, everyone. I'm Guillaume Sinclair from TIPS. It's mostly for Julia and Imraan on the renewable energy program. We know that it's not sustainable to carry on probably with guarantees, but now we've removed the 100 megawatt licensing requirement. So we effectively have two markets, one with the REAP program with local content requirements, potential guarantees, and another market, which is totally private, no guarantees, no local content requirements, no nothing. How do you see that panning out? Is the REAP even going to survive pretty much?
Okay, thank you. So I think we'll just follow the order of the speakers in answering the question. So Imraan and Julia, if you want to start, please.
Maybe just to kind of explain a key point which I missed in the transition from me to Julia. I think the point that we wanting to make essentially is that the kind of energy transition that we're doing now is one small part of a much larger transition that we're going to have to make. That what we've done in that first case is effectively to kind of incentivize the change by the state taking on a huge responsibility to de-risk the large investments that have to be made. I think what the kind of renewables project suggests to us is that, and perhaps this in part kind of explains Kaila's kind of question, that process gets you to a point where much more of the risk can down the line be shifted onto the private sector, as you've outlined. The real question is how much of that risk should the state take on? Where does that risk sit? And I think with the benefit of hindsight, I think the kind of evidence that Julia was presenting is that the state perhaps took on too much of that risk. I'll pass it on to Julia to deal with the specifics of it. Just on the two other questions, on the health question from the colleague from the NUM. So it seems quite clear that from I'm not a health expert, but from those that I talk to, that increased temperatures will have serious implications for health. So take one area, take child and maternal health. The kind of evidence is quite clear. Higher temperatures mean many more complications all along that chain, from kind of pre-birth to childbirth to the first few years of a child's life, to the mother's health during that time. I think the macroeconomic and fiscal implications of those sorts of things are factors that we kind of really have to start thinking about. Kind of on the growth question, yeah, we've not done any of the detailed sector by sector analysis. We're concerned about the macroeconomics of growth. I think the kind of essence of the question is kind of how can South Africa emerge from this transition, not being the kind of mineral exporter that it is now, and kind of how can we build some sort of industrial policy plans that will shift the economy in a way that would put us onto a more sustainable growth path. Let me pass it on to Julia.
Thanks. I'm not going to limit the time that the presenters have to answer questions, but I do want to say that if we do want another session or round of questions, maybe just try and do it quicker, but I'm not going to impose a time on you.
Thanks, Seeraj. So just on the decentralization question, so currently with the kind of lifting of the 100 megawatt cap on independent power producers and increasing kind of measures and adaptation of regulation to encourage private entities to kind of generate their own electricity. That means that our whole grid is going to suddenly become less, well, not suddenly, but is slowly starting to become less centralized. Because if you think about Mpumalanga as the center of energy production in South Africa, it's kind of the heart of the country, and the grid spreads out into all provinces. And that kind of shift where actually energy is going to be moving in the other direction, where individuals are producing energy in their homes, smaller independent power producers are going to spring up. That has consequences for grid maintenance, because a lot of the kind of the design of the grid isn't built for that. It needs to kind of be upgraded significantly. Costs are anticipated to be in kind of in the realm of 180 billion rand in the next 10 years. Just checking if that's correct. Yes, that's right. So so this shift and shifting off municipal grids is going to affect municipalities' revenues, because they have they kind of on-sell electricity to users. And actually electricity tariffs are a source of revenue for municipalities. So we need to then rethink the municipal kind of funding system, because municipalities are not going to have the revenues from affluent consumers who are able to defect from the grid, have their own solar power systems on their roofs. So it has quite big implications for municipal finance. I'm not going to kind of touch, I think Imraan covered all the other questions really well. Thanks.
So there were no specific questions, but I just want to take the one on impact on health. And again, I'd like to bring in the Indian perspective here. The fact that it is perceived largely that brown is bad and green is good is kind of a myth when we see the realities on the ground. And there are issues with both. If we take energy transition, for example, there are issues with both coal sector as well as the renewable energy sector that is coming up, and we can take health as an example for that. While the coal sector jobs are more secured and permanent with comparatively better incomes, the jobs in the renewable energy sector are more seasonal and also often not covered under contract employer-employee contracts. For instance, just on the basis of number of jobs, if we see For a typical coal-based power plant in India, 1 megawatt of capacity corresponds to 1 permanent worker being deployed there. Whereas in case of a solar park or a wind park, or even of 100 megawatts, only 5 to 10% of the workers are permanent, and rest are on a seasonal basis, particularly during the time of construction. The health-related causal factors that causes adverse impacts on coal sector could be the fly ash and the respiratory and skin-related disorders it can cause, or the living conditions and the poor hygiene in which these vulnerable workers live. While it is in the green energy sector or the renewable energy sector, the broader issue at hand is the health of the entire community and biodiversity. And the issues that we see rising in India are these solar parks and wind parks creating these high tension lines, which often cause loss of life, human life, as well as of endangered and critical species that live there. Also, the seasonal nature of these green energy related jobs are one of the causes for their low adaptive capacity and high vulnerability in order to out of pocket expenditure for health related expenses. And there is also a case of a capture of public resources when doing private investments in green energy sector, resources such as land and water and agricultural fields, which are a source of sustainable incomes for vulnerable communities. And when it is taken away, again, their adaptive capacity to account for any health related mishaps decrease. So there are issues in both, and yeah, that's my submission, that brown is bad, green is good is a myth.
Okay. Oh, thank you very much, and thanks for that good answer, Sarthak. We're going to have a really short next round. I think we try and limit it to 3 questions because we do have to think about lunch and then also not taking up too much time for this session. So if there are 3 pressing questions and also short questions, please put up your hand.
Hello.
Very quickly.
This is Stugazi from Toyota. So this is not specifically for the panel that is sitting there, but maybe a more general question. I understand BMN Tips has done a study on the automotive industry, on the just transition. Will we hear any about that within the sessions in the next 2 days, or is that a separate platform? Because I can hear it's all about energy today.
Okay, thank you. There was another question in the next row, next column.
Thanks. It's not present, but I'm going to ask anyway. So a quick one for Nishal. The shipping rent and the market rents, particularly in the production of renewable technologies, in my view, have already been distributed in intellectual property rights by corporates, mainly in advanced economies. So should South Africa or probably African countries be using their scarce financial resources in trying to develop some of these technologies?
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Thank you. This one is for Julia. You mentioned building state capacity as a need to ensure the just transition. From a local government perspective, how does that look like in your research?
Okay, so this time I'm going to get the presenters to go in reverse order, and also ask them to be conscious about time and lunch. Thank you. So we'll start with Sarthak. Okay, then Nishal.
Hi, thanks, Elvis. Should we be investing scarce financial resources in trying to develop our own intellectual property in the renewable energy area? I mean, I must say this is not my area, and so I'm kind of hesitant to dive too deeply into it. And I guess by way of answer, I would say that the kind of relevant exercise that we probably need to do is to have an assessment of what what proportion of costs in the current RE kinds of programs are flowing out of the country to perhaps advanced economies where this intellectual property resides. versus versus the benefits of a relatively more rapid transition by simply paying for the existing IP and trying to transition as rapidly as possible. But I haven't done that exercise. Possibly Tips has, I'm not sure, but I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much for the question. On building state capacity, how do we do this at the local level? I definitely don't have the answers, but I think it's kind of a question of, in my thinking, in terms of this question around municipal funding, kind of if this is going to, this decentralization of electricity and shifting in tariff structures is going to affect municipal funding, that's an issue for local capacity. So I think we need to start thinking about what are new ways for financing local capacity and how can we support that. But I don't know if Imraan, you want to add anything to that?
So I'll kind of keep it short because I'm kind of between you and your lunch. I thought it would be worth it. So we have focused in this kind of session on the energy things, but I think what our paper's trying to do is to, and kind of all of us have been suggesting we need to start thinking about kind of about the larger questions beyond energy. So I quickly checked up the data on health. So this comes out of a systematic review. So for those of you who aren't academics, a kind of systematic review takes all of the research that's been done, kind of assesses the implications of that, and tries to kind of evaluate how valid something is and what the key finding is. So arising out of a systematic review, the kind of the risk of a preterm kind of pregnancy is expected to rise by 5% per kind of degrees Celsius that the world will warm up. And I think it's kind of implications like that I think we need to start thinking about, and thinking about the macroeconomic implications of that.
Okay, so I do want to thank our presenters very much for really interesting and thought-provoking presentations. I think we've ended on quite a serious note, where we're not only talking about energy, but we're actually looking at people and well-being. And to say that I think moving forward, we need to think about resilience and the role of macroeconomic policy in building that resilience and moving away from questions of, what the market can do and the kind of laissez-faire approach, but towards thinking about what we can't afford not to spend on and the implications of that, but also to fit that into a program where we can actually look at improving people's well-being and expand the economy while doing that. And I think the role for macroeconomic policy thinking, the role of the state, monetary and fiscal policy within that's really important. And I would urge people to continue doing that work. So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for the questions. Can we give them a final round of applause?
Hi again, everyone. I'm Guillaume Masson-Claire. I'm a senior economist at TIPS. And there's one more milestone before your lunch, just to get the appetite going. We thought it would be really relevant to show a little snippet of a documentary that TIPS has produced recently on the just transition. TIPS has been working now for a couple of years with partners, Naledi and Groundwork and Pita Wolpe, in Emalasheni and in Steve Truete on the just transition, working with local stakeholders, communities, workers, trade unions, local government, but also local businesses, to try and really bring bottom-up perspectives to national level policies and vice versa to try and get a lot of the national level developments to the ground. And in doing that work, we really came up with the idea to say, well, what's better to give a voice to the people on the ground than actually do a little video? Because the moment, of course, we try to do that ourselves, we put our own frame of mind onto that. A video does that very powerfully. We produced a documentary, it's about half an hour. It's available online on YouTube. It's freely available. You can watch it. You can use it. Some of you may have already seen it. We're not going to show you the whole video today, but we just wanted to show you a little bit of a snippet of that. And it's a really great tool, even in your engagements, your meetings, to really get a good idea of the challenges on the ground, the opportunities, and really the voice of people who are on the ground, in Malahleni, in CCRED, not the people in Pretoria, in Joburg, or in Cape Town, but actually the people on the ground. So without further ado, we can just fire up the video, and that will be the last introduction to your lunch.
Valodia has 12 power stations, and most of the coal mines in the country are also. You can see there's a factory on. Mostly it's from the power plant. Secondly, it's from the blasting that takes place.
In 2 municipalities. That provides an opportunity for action because we know where to act, but that also provides a crucial challenge.
Most of the towns developed because of the mines and because of the power stations. You get rid of the mines, you get rid of the power stations, you kill towns. And the majority of people in this province will be without jobs.
Because the entirety of the economy of those municipalities is dependent on coal.
Coal is food. Coal is life.
Especially in Mpumalanga, in Malahleni, it's life.
It's all I know. So without the coal, there's no jobs.
My lungs are getting blocked because of the dust.
A hidden killer. A life full of sickness. It's not life.
And the worst part is that the mines are taking the water from the people.
Because that water is contaminated.
It's years we have been talking about this.
But we are not being listened.
So it's a double-edged sword. It's life and death.
We sound as if we want to make people choose between your health and earning an income. But I've been reading the news this morning, and then they say Eskom is like the biggest sulfur polluter in the world.
The season itself now is gone haywire. You get winter rain, you get cold in summer. So,
my daughter was saying to me the other day, this summer it's a scam. I have never seen such a summer. It is a scam because most of the time it's summer, but it's so cold.
If you connect all the stories, it becomes easy for you to link with what is happening.
The Paris Agreement talks about trying to limit the warming of the globe to 1.5 degrees, but you have to multiply it by 2 to look at the impacts in Southern Africa. So from a South African perspective, we are very vulnerable, not only to the changes in the climate, but also to our trade partners transitioning as well.
And if everything from South Africa will be boycotted, if we don't comply, then we are dead.
Climate change is not just an environmental issue. It's never been, right? It's a social issue. It's a political issue. So with all of those elements coalescing, it's very, very clear that that the just transition is a non-negotiable for the country.
Debate is not to transition to a low carbon economy or not. That's not the debate here. We have to transition, else we have a big problem. We are in trouble as a species, as society. The question is, we transition in a just or in an unjust way. As we stand, there's no agreement on what we mean by just transition.
there is a real reason for us to move from where we are to a just transition. We understand that. But I'm from the trade unions. Wherever I am, I will resist when it comes to job losses. I would say no.
We're talking about 150,000 direct jobs and an estimated 650,000 indirect jobs.
Unions and business have to work together, otherwise we all lose.
And some people understand that as just transition. Others, more ambitious, see it as a platform to transform society.
We see it as better health services, better transport. We see it as a basic income grant.
Just transition is about us changing the way we live, our lifestyles. It is about us reducing the high rate of consumerism.
We would miss a massive opportunity if we don't pursue that transformative agenda. That means participatory justice, making sure that the process itself is inclusive. And then it's about distributive justice. Whoever loses their job, loses their livelihood as the result of the transition should have an alternative. And it is also about restorative justice. Can we improve access to services? Can we improve the direct environment of people in terms of air, water, land? Can we have a better economy for all? Can we address those historical inequalities?
The minds are moving in the center of the community. They're blasting each and everything.
We are talking about a just transition, but why are still these licenses being given out? If we are serious about moving from coal to clean energy.
As organs of state, we need to talk in one voice.
No one must be left behind.
When the president speaks, the minister should not contradict him.
So that's where I think the central government is lacking. Now I'm speaking like as an employee of local government. How are we going to do it? It is not clear how it's going to be done.
Often people ask me, what's the most difficult thing you think with the just energy transition? It's not technology, it's mindsets. Having people's mindsets change is the most difficult part, I think.
Most big companies have what they call a CSI budget, which they have to spend. And that has to be spent on the communities that are around the mines. But I think if mining companies were more ethical, I think most companies could do a lot more.
So I think corporations, some of them willingly, but some of them are being forced by their shareholders and investors to change that mindset.
We can move away from the coal part. What are you going to replace it with for us?
Until we create those new jobs, whoever is set to lose is going to resist the transition.
Before they bring something, they must bring skill first. They can't just bring something and say, no, we need artisans like this and this and this without any trainings.
Over the next 10 years, 10 billion is going to be spent in the province of Mpumalanga on your just transition.
We need to start creating those jobs to show that, yes, there are some alternatives. This could be in energy. This could be in manufacturing, in agriculture, in tourism.
The best thing is to focus on alternatives, because these alternatives are the ones that are going to actually deliver us the future.
In order for us to make meaningful shift, we need workers and community people to be involved. They haven't been included in decision making.
Because now we are talking of a just transition, a fair change. What will be fair if we are not involved as communities? Because at the end of the day, those policies bind us.
If any organization come to us as communities, we must discuss the solutions.
Stop the talk shops.
We know all of us the problems. We don't need to discuss the problems anymore.
We're really pushing on getting in there, working with the communities and starting these projects, because we've been talking for long enough now.
We know what needs to be done. The question is, do we have the political will to do it? And are the interests of all aligned?
At the end of the day, there won't be any jobs in a dead planet.
The environment has no boundary. So we need to watch that space and make sure that whatever we do is for the betterment of our community. Thank you.
Thanks, Galo, for that introduction. I think it
is a great 8 minute to center ourselves and really consider who we ultimately serve. As we are sitting here in Pretoria, we thought let's be as inclusive as possible, even if it's superficial. We're moving on till lunch, but I do want to acknowledge those who are online and their questions. Henk, Temba, Tamara, I acknowledge your questions. I'll direct them straight to the panelists and we can get a conversation going. Apologies for that. Just bear with us as we're doing this hybrid format for the first time. We have 2 sessions after lunch. You'll select session 2 remains in here, session 3 across the quad. Enjoy your lunch.